This session is loosely centered around master and reference data. So that's chapter 10 of the DMBOK. It's 10% of the CDMP fundamentals exam, and it's also one of the options for the specialist exams. As a reminder, if you want to proceed to the master or the practitioner level of DAMA accreditation, then you need to have 2 specialist exams. It depends on your tier, but either 70% for practitioner or 80% for master. Right now, we're going to transition into our first Pomodoro. So the intention here is to grab your book, grab whatever study materials you have prepared for the day. I'm going to start sharing my screen and we'll get into our first silent reading portion of the Pomodoro. Okay, welcome back, everybody. To kick us off in our first of the Pomodoro breaks, we're going to have a bit of discussion, but first I wanted to do introductions.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Knudel. I passed the CDMP exam some time ago, I think 2 years ago, if my memory serves me right. And one thing that led me here to Data Strategy Pros was basically I was able to pass the exam through the help of Nicole's materials. I decided to join her team. I'm glad to be here. Glad to connect with you guys on LinkedIn and message me in case you need any tips and tricks or just pointers for the exam.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. And if you guys will permit a short advertising break, we also have career coaching. That's what Mark says when he means he's joined the team, and he'll also be doing our discussion groups for next year. I want to highlight those 2 things just really quickly for you guys. So career coaching is here. We have a whole description about how this works. And for those of you who've been to past sessions, you may have met Seth. He's our other career coach. Mark is also helping with data governance space since he's an expert on that topic. And then in 2024, we will have Mark at 1 Eastern time. So thank you. This video is brought to you by Data Strategy Professionals. Okay, thanks for letting me do that ad break.
Sorry, I joined late, so I'm hoping to catch up now. But I did read it once. I'm hoping that use this time to just refresh my memory.
Yes, review. Repeated exposure is very important for the CDMP because there's just so much material. It takes everyone a couple of times.
Absolutely, I agree.
Yeah, this is Naresh. Take these exams as many as you can.
That's a good piece of advice.
Quizzes.
I just had a follow-up question. I did take the practice exam a few times, but I feel like after a while, the questions keep repeating. They're just in a different order.
They say the test bank has 200 questions in it, but I think there's a general consensus that there's not actually 200. So they do repeat. We offer some practice exams on our website. So if you do want additional questions, you can find them. I'll post a link in the chat.
I guess I wanted to clarify the questions that Naresh and you are referring to are the ones you enroll to take the exam on that portal.
Yes. For anybody who hasn't yet purchased the exam from DAMA, we definitely recommend doing that instead of buying the practice questions because you're just burning $40 if you do that. So just go ahead, and if you're confident that you are committed to taking the CDMP, then once you buy the exam, you get those practice questions. They call it take the practice exam once you're inside the portal.
Nicole's 3 sets you sell?
Yes, that's correct.
With explanation she provided with, not only just answer, you will know what is the reasoning behind that. It helped me too.
I can echo that same comment as well. A difference between the DAMA set of questions in the practice exam that you can get there. You can practice answering the questions and so forth, but you don't really get an explanation. What really helped me prepare for the exam was the Data Strategy Pros set of practice questions can come with an explanation. Even refer to the chapter and the page of the book that it refers to. Not just an explanation, but even a reference that you can also read back to. And that actually helps you learn why that answer was correct, rather than just knowing that that answer is correct, but more of what's actually behind the answer, and that helps you prepare. So it's a little bit of a different flavor of a practice set or a set of questions that the answer key actually has a good explanation of why the answer is there.
That's helpful. And then I guess the other pointer I wanted to know from your experience, folks, is like I have an ebook. I do not have a hard copy, and that's the read-only version. So I don't have a way to tag or put stickies around for quick reference. That's one thing I might be a little challenged when I'm maneuvering pages, especially, I know where it is. It's just that the scrolling or getting to that page, it may take a few seconds, just cut down on my overall test time.
I'm not sure if somebody else wanted to take this one, but from my perspective, if you are using Adobe, they have a free tool called PDF Reader, and you should be able to do everything except for make notes in that document. So you should be able to highlight it and make annotations. DAMA does have some restrictions on the book. People have written to say that it's password protected, so further editing is not permitted. I had a physical copy of the book, so if somebody else wants to speak to their experience using the ebook, feel free to jump in. But my understanding is that the best tool is Adobe's PDF reader.
There was a key point, though, from Nikita that I want to highlight. Nikita, did you say for the exam itself? Because you mentioned test time, your overall test time, right? You mentioned as a resource during the exam,
Yes,
right? Yeah.
that's what I.
During the exam, at least as from my experience, is that either from the physical book or the PDF, you won't have time to browse through the book. Believe me, if you're under time pressure, you will not have time to find anything and so forth, right? So what I did, I had a huge table, all the chapters separated with just notes.
Let me interject here. They
Yeah,
actually
go
have
ahead.
changed their guidance as of January 2023. You can no longer use notes. You can only use the
then
book. It was a little easier for all of us who took it before that. If you annotate or highlight your book, you can use that, but you can't have a separate reference, even if it's just your notes.
No way. That's such a bummer.
Sorry.
I would
I'm so
suggest to have marks for each chapter, and maybe on the back of one page or PDF or whatever, right? At least have your main notes for that chapter, like the key points, because you wouldn't generally only have one page that you can refer to. You won't be able to browse pages. Make sure that you have an easy way to get to a chapter. That's one. And then just have bullet points of that chapter as a reference for the exam.
As Mark mentioned, the ideal way is exam is 60 minutes. You should take all 100 questions in the first 40 or 45 minutes. Whether you know correct answer, you are pretty much sure. Some are not. Even though if it is not, just a guess and mark that question. Go move forward. Don't go to the book. Then last 15 minutes, you can come back. At least if you have 20 questions, you mark for a reference. Don't try to attempt for 20. Goal is at least 10, 50% of marked questions. You get a chance to go book or whatever electronic copy. Use all 90 minutes.
Gotcha. Okay.
Okay, so we've had a couple questions around the format of the exam and ideas to prepare. Just to echo what Naresh was saying, the guidance I typically give people is to go all the way through the exam at a reasonable pace. This way, you know for sure that you're going to get to the end before the 90 minutes are up. And then I actually had a good 10 to 12 minutes at the end, and I used that time to review questions that I was unsure of. But to Mark's point, you also don't have a ton of time to browse questions. And if you do that, you run the risk of actually not finishing the exam and leaving questions blank. And that will for sure hurt you versus at least if you're not sure and you take your best guess, you have a reasonable chance of actually getting the correct answer. If you were a monkey throwing a dart, you have a 20% chance of getting it right just by virtue of math. Definitely make sure you answer every question. Don't throw darts at your computer. Don't let monkeys take the exam for you. I'm pretty sure that's cheating. Let's get a little bit of reading done. We only have a couple of minutes left in this reading session. So we'll go to that and then we will come back together and I will share a couple of my notes about master and reference data. All right. Essentially, master and reference data, as we know, it provides control over the values that are considered to be of the highest level of importance for the enterprise. So these are the records that the enterprise determines that they want to have a shared version across business units. And there's various approaches to doing this. So we'll talk about that as we kind of transition into these slides. First thing, I just want to touch quickly on maybe the difference between these two terms. The first is master data. So this is that core set of values. Maybe this is a consolidated view of the business's customers. So ideally, you perform a process called entity resolution, where you're bringing together all the information. And in one business unit, Nicole Janeway Bills has her phone number as this value. And in a different business unit, there's a Nicole Bills who has the same phone number. So then determining like, oh, is this actually the same person? Or maybe I've updated my phone number. So making sure that information is kind of stored and consolidated so that you have one single view of the customer. That is the dream of master data. And obviously this can be extremely challenging, but that's the challenge that we're faced with as data practitioners. Not just customers, but some other things that might be stored as master data is like any group of people. So it could be customers, vendors, suppliers, contacts, whatever sort of descriptors of entities that are valuable to the business. Some other common master data concepts are locations, products, like a core centralized view of all the information about products, and then information about the business structure as well. That is your quick look at what is entailed by the term master data. And then reference data is information that adds context or enhances the value of existing data. When we're talking about the concept of data valuation, which is determining the monetary value or the benefit to the organization of holding a particular data set, reference data, combining in information from outside the organization, can actually play a really significant role here in terms of enhancing the quality and the usability and the value of our existing data resources. So that's one thing to think about. And then also just want to highlight that within the context of this chapter, reference data is a subset of master data. It's information that is typically stored at the enterprise level, and ideally it is valuable across the business. Multiple functions might get use out of reference data sets.
Nicole, regarding the reference data, is reference data always external? My understanding was it can also be something which is internal to the organization.
It can also be internal. Yeah, thank you. That's a good point. Okay, since we're paused, other questions or comments, or does anybody else want to provide context on Nikita's statement? Yeah, that is a good point and a good correction for this slide. So let's talk a little bit more about what these terms entail. When we're talking about master data, typically the goal again is to create a golden record. So this is the best possible representation of a specific entity. This involves consolidating information from multiple source systems, matching and merging, sometimes referred to as, again, entity resolution process. Ultimately, you end up with a final source of truth record. The process of creating this data results in what's called a master value.
That's for once preparing for exam, that's something to take note. I didn't even recognize it, Nicole, but it's a good point that you pointed out that terminologies are different for reference and for master data, right? So they might have the same term, but different. I'm just recognizing that once you recognize a term, make sure that you associated it to master data or also to reference data. They might have different definitions yet.
In fact, we do have a practice question that's written just like that, where it's like, which of the following terms is not associated with master data or is more commonly associated with reference data? A lot of the CDMP is very vocabulary heavy. I'll just do another promotional ad break for data strategy professionals. I was just going to say we cover all of the vocab really extensively in our CDMP fundamentals notes. So unfortunately, you can no longer access this document on the exam. Again, you can only have your one book.
This is amazing, Nicole.
These notes really made a difference for me. If you do get to them, I would say try to see how you can best work with it during the exam. Copy them over to one of the back of the sheets, probably as an annotation to the book, maybe somewhere on the side behind one of the chapter intro pages, maybe, or something like this. These notes were really helpful. So if you can incorporate it in the most appropriate and legal way to take the exam, they really made a difference. And that's why I also had a debt to Data Strategy Pros and getting me ready. That's why I also wanted to give back, and why I'm here and also giving these tips and tricks to the others, so that you can also pass it.
Thanks, Mark. Dama does encourage you to take notes in your book. Definitely, please annotate your book. Make that into a good resource for your future self.
When you see master data in your notes, you associate with concepts and entities. Reference data is more associated with values and domains. And then you say that reference data is a subset of master data. Or subset relationship is the relationship of the value with the entity, which means actually attribute with the entity. Because let's say I have reference data of colors and they should be written in a certain way. Let's say it's a control vocabulary. That's reference data, yes?
Yeah.
And then I have cars, and these are master data. But the car has a color, which is taken from the reference data. What I wanted to say that some attributes of concept are simply taken from a predefined domain that is reference data.
Let me give a shot at this, Nicole. Ravi, because you're referring to the point where reference data is a subset, which Nicole said is sub part of a master data. So let's take an example, customer, right? You generally take that as master data where you have your customer name, customer number, and so forth, right? And in that customer master data, you would also have the type of customer or maybe the geographical location of that customer. Now that becomes more of a reference to the master data, right? So you say you're a data practitioner, so we're saying dimensions to that fact table, right? So that master data will have all these attributes. This master table will have all this master data entity will have all these attributes, customer name, customer number, but then there will be attributes that are going to be part of a reference data, right? Such as location and geography and so forth. And let's take an example, city. Now, you have to also somewhat apply certain rules on that reference, because you cannot just use the data that is always being used on each and every customer, but you have to control that reference list of cities as well, right? That München is not determined as Munich and so forth. You have to also clean that up. So all your reference dimensions, let's say, to the master data, that's why Nicole was saying that reference data is a subset of master data because it's being used in the master data, but it is still controlled or cleaned up outside the master data entity itself.
Isn't this what I said?
Yeah, that's the point we were
Okay,
saying there.
yeah, we agree.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, so we are in our final independent reading section of the session. So let's jump into that, and then we will reconvene at the end to wrap up and say goodbye. All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming and for participating in this discussion about master and reference data. So again, this is an important chapter. It's valuable to our work as data strategists, and it is an option for the CDMP specialist exams. So definitely a good one. Good for those of you who've already passed and are returning to brush up on your knowledge, as well as those of you who are studying for the CDMP and hopefully going to take it before the end of the year or coming up really soon. So thanks again, guys. Any final questions about master and reference data before we wrap up here?
Just one question I had. So the data sharing architecture for reference and master data, there are a bunch that are referenced in the book. One is hub and spoke, there is registry, there is transaction hub and consolidated. I think there is also data sharing hub. What is not included in the book is virtualized and repository. Although I know that question comes up frequently, at least in the practice test.
Yeah.
So I always get confused because I've never come across those terms, virtualized and repository, in the book.
Okay. Well, they do talk about virtualization a little bit in the data integration chapter. So you might check out that section to understand the concept. And any of those data integration approaches could be utilized to store master and reference data. Okay. Thanks for the question. That is a good one. Well, if that's it, then I'll just say thank you again for coming. We will do this again in a month from now. October, we will meet up and we'll be discussing my personal favorite chapter, which is data warehousing and business intelligence. That one is also 10% of the fundamentals exam. So do try to make time for it if you can come. And it is also an option for the specialist exam. So we pretty much just have like important chapters until we finish up the book. Less so for what they call the big data chapter, but we'll do that one along with data quality in December. So anyway, thank you guys so much for coming. If you think of any more questions, feel free to shoot an email, or I'm always available on LinkedIn. We've got the Facebook group. So lots of ways to keep in touch and let us know how your exam prep process is going.
Great. Thanks. These are great. Thanks, Nicole.
Yeah.
About the relation of master and reference data with transactional data. Could you comment on this, please?
So transaction data could be a system of reference or an input source into master data. Or is there another aspect of the transaction data that you want to ask about?
Let's say the concept transaction itself, isn't it considered as master data?
Not necessarily. If you're running a business, storing each isolated transaction as master data could be too cumbersome, like a huge data set. It's not necessarily value that is of the highest level of importance across the entire business. Transaction level data is probably too granular to serve as master data.
Right. So the way I see it is transaction because it's constantly changing, and master is more like stabilized. That really depends on the context, like how frequently the data is changing. But master is when the data has been processed, it's in complete status, integrity wise and stable. That's when you are able to move it to the master phase, maybe at the data warehouse stage. Again, that really depends on the business needs. But like you said, it could be an input to the transactional data.
It's a bit confusing actually when we use the term data, because it is used interchangeably for data set, for entity, for attribute, for value. And whenever we attribute quality or an adjective to data, one wouldn't know we're talking about what. You see the point?
Data is an overloaded term.
When we say data change, what does change? Is it the data set itself? I mean, the table? Is it the line, which is an instance, or what is that?
Yeah, I don't think we're going to be able to fix that in one co-working session.
I just wanted to chip in that from my own perspective, the relationship I can see between transaction data, master data, and all this, that those are the building blocks. your master data and your reference data, they need to first of all be in existence, right? They are what we hate the transaction to happen that will now lead to you being able to get your transaction data. I don't know if that makes so. I can say your transaction data, when you are looking at your transaction data, you can now be seeing how your master data and your reference data play out. See it there. And it from your transaction data, if there are gaps in your master data and your reference data, it's going to give you data issues from the transaction data that you now have. That's from my perspective.
Good to hear from data practitioners and how they're thinking about these terminology. Let's wrap it up here. We can always continue these conversations in the LinkedIn group or the CDMP study group on Facebook. But yeah, thank you guys so much for coming and have a great rest of your Thursday.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Thank you
everybody.
very much.